Hey guys, on the neighboring continent, we see a crowd of people surrounding something. They were looking at absolute classes. This was a rule created by the heroes. Even if you saved the world from the brink of destruction, you couldn't even think about making a mistake. You'd have to face punishment. Your punishment would be the Gilha. And why that name? Because the traitors would have to have their coconut split in half. The first emperor would also be the first to test this Gilha due to his acts of treason. He was sentenced to that thing. Then it descends and kind of drags the little guy up. But his legacy was not left behind. Today, I bring you a story where our protagonist is humiliated and even betrayed, but he returns for revenge. As in the future, we see two extras surrounding a kid, but they were beating the little guy up. The reason was that our protagonist took the blame, but the real reason was that they wanted to humiliate. Even when humiliated, he didn't back down. Our protagonist kept sending his their way. Because, in the past, about 100 years ago, these creatures in front of him would be nothing but a small worm, and breathing near them would basically be a reason for the extras to suffer for life. But since that was in the past, they can now do this to our boy. They end up knocking our boy to the ground. After knocking him down, they grab a whip, but our protagonist, seeing that thing coming at him, simply grabs it in his hand. Currently, our protagonist managed to become something that wasn't even worth $1 note. But even becoming that, our protagonist was a noble. However, nobles are those who have these marks on their hand, and since our protagonist wasn't chosen by some gods, he doesn't have any rights. And while they were ready to send our protagonist, somewhere, someone in the background appears. This was our girl, who suddenly shows up and stops them from doing what they were about to do to our protagonist. She asks them to leave soon because someone important was calling for them. They, not liking it at all, leave anyway. As they leave, they comment that they haven't finished with our protagonist yet. Once she leaves with her group, she sticks close to our protagonist. As soon as she gets closer to our protagonist, she wonders if he's okay. The kid had some broken stuff, but he was whole. This was Mia, an elf who has almost the same fate as our protagonist. But now she gets closer to our guy, apologizing to him because she took the blame for something that wasn't his fault. She ended up breaking some dishes, but our boy took the worst of it. Still, he says he's okay. Those extras were always trying to set something up against our protagonist, but their chat doesn't last too long. Our boy leaves and heads to a training ground, where he takes care of some weapons in the background. While he's cleaning some armor, we see him getting extremely annoyed with his own family. About 5 years ago, his grandfather betrayed his own family, and because of that, his family was persecuted by everyone. So his own parents asked him to run with our protagonist. But those who couldn't run were also his parents. Our protagonist's brother, who was dragged away by some people, ends up being taken by them, which already leaves our protagonist very annoyed with such an act. Moreover, our protagonist sees that the people who are now on top of him are mocking him, and he doesn't like to see everyone laughing. At first, he wants to laugh a bit, but his thoughts are interrupted when an extra suddenly appears in the background and then slaps our protagonist on the head. Soon after, he asks our main character to walk a bit faster. He was taking too long at his job. As he moves to the background, our protagonist complains to himself, as in the near future, he will be achieving a statue, and when he does, he will do what is right to make these extras learn a bit in life. But our elf, who saw all this happening, asks our protagonist to let her help him clean those swords a little. While cleaning the swords, our protagonist tells the elf that he has a kind of mark on his hand, and if he shows it to some people, he will get what he desires. She wonders what this thing is, and he starts explaining that after his family fell, people were crazy to get the emperor's first seal. It turns out our protagonist was the one with that seal, and people did everything to get it from him. He underwent some types of torture, but this was part of his daily life. However, this was not their main goal. They also implanted some demonic cells of darkness in the boy's body, hoping to awaken his power all at once, but this failed as they discovered he would never be able to awaken the holy power seal. So, they simply discarded him, only using him to offend him in front of others, and they felt at ease. But after those guys took our protagonist and did harm to him, he managed to survive, albeit unhappily in this story, or almost. Behind, two extras appear. One of them grabs our elf. As soon as he grabs her, our protagonist stands up to try to save her, but the other kicks him. However, while our protagonist is thrown away, we can see this thing goofing around there. Changing the subject, we see another extra commenting that if our protagonist was eliminated for some reason, nobody in town would care about him. At this point, our protagonist already knew that, so he asks them to let the elf go alone. But seeing that they wouldn't, he grabs a knife. Now with that in hand, he throws it towards those extras, but they stop that movement with their hand. Then, with a little push, that knife ends up running at full speed towards our protagonist. He manages to dodge in time, but jumping up, that knife was stubborn. It comes off the ground and chases our protagonist. As it was in the air, he couldn't dodge it, and he gets hit head-on by that knife he threw at them. Now falling to the ground, we can see the guy appearing from behind, laughing at our protagonist. Not only does he laugh, but he also mocks our protagonist endlessly. We can then see a shadow of a familiar character appearing behind this extra, asking if he's basically wasting his life's time, as he should be focusing on. In his training, this figure who appeared was the vice leader of this place, and he had more control over everything. As soon as he saw the vice leader in this place, he kind of pointed towards our main character and commented there that our protagonist had used a weapon of his to attack this poor defenseless guy here. As soon as he realized this, he went towards our protagonist. While walking towards him, he kept saying that our protagonist had possibly done something to him. However, when he reached the kid, he just ended up punching our prota's belly. The kid fell to his knees, but he couldn't stay down that easily. Another person appeared behind our prota and simply lowered his head, and the reason for doing this was that our protagonist could be pulling out some kind of hidden weapon on him to attack the vice captain. The vice captain got mad at our protagonist. The vice captain landed a blow on our prota's most critical point and was pleased to know that our boy didn't even scream. Our elf girl asked to leave our prota alone, but facing our hero, he mentioned his father and mother, who both had some brutally strong combat power. Our protagonist, on the other hand, was just a loser who had no talents. Now, what this vice wanted from our prota was just a dog looking for its owner, who would never find him again. He was just a guy who was no good for anything. But our protagonist, upon hearing this, simply kicks the guy's butt. After pulling this stunt on our vice captain, he explains that it was this guy in front of him who was basically looking for his owner since he wanted to mess with the vice captain. He points towards our elf. That elf, to our protagonist, was possibly someone he liked or was just a friend, but even so, after turning our protagonist into a slave, he practically lost all humanity. And even losing all that, our protagonist still didn't give up because messing with our prota was too annoying. He only thinks of doing this because they're messing with the people our protagonist likes the most in the world. Facing him, he comes with his knife in hand. He stabs her, she screams in pain, and our protagonist yells for them to stop. Moreover, he stabbed her in a rather critical place. Pulling out that knife was a black mark for our elf. At this moment, our protagonist remembers a bit of his past, recalling the suffering he had. This activated his fury mode. Our protagonist frees himself from the extra, startling him with his strength, but it was too late. For our protagonist, having managed to escape from there, he removes that knife. But at that moment, our protagonist was already facing him, but he doesn't let our prota get close with a kick. Only our vice captain manages to kick him, and after that kick our protagonist received, he's thrown back a bit. As he was thrown back, our protagonist began to close his eyes, but right there, he started to hear a voice in his mind. This voice that appeared in our protagonist's mind starts talking to him, saying that if he wants a bit of power from him, he just has to take it. Ignoring this, he rises up, but there he had a chance. This single chance was to be able to revive. Moreover, this creature talking about our protagonist is quite protagonist's potential because it had been years since he found someone he could live inside the body of. So, he would just borrow our protagonist's body for a while. A little while after he says this, something red starts to grow in our protagonist's hand. Then, he stands up. Geraldo there is surprised to see our protagonist quite alive, but well, this wouldn't happen again. An extra next to our protagonist starts running towards him, saying that the end of our protagonist would be here and now. Getting closer, out of nowhere, he feels a punch. He sort of took a hit from behind. The guy falls flat on the ground. Seeing him down, his companions are also surprised by our protagonist's strength. Lying on the ground, the vice captain looks at another extra in the background, asking him to take care of our prota, but looking at our protagonist, he starts to believe in the strength and timing coming from our protagonist. He wonders if this guy is crazy. Right then, memories of sadness and suffering flood into our protagonist's mind, and the guy shouts. But our protagonist wonders why he listened to that voice in his mind. The voice says it was useless, but it was enough to activate the power. Now it would lend power to our protagonist but would stay in the background, in the darkness, just watching everything happening to our protagonist. Since it lent power to our prota, it's curious about what's happening to our guy. Thus, he leaves. The one who had his face smashed into the ground stands up, wondering how our protagonist, a mere slave, dared to hit him. Then, he runs towards our protagonist. The vice captain shouts for him to go back. He had no chance against our protagonist anymore. Ignoring him, he tries to hit our protagonist, but our guy dodges. Not giving up, he tries several sequences of attacks on our protagonist, but all his blows miss. Angry at his misses, he uses a mark on his hand. He grabs our protagonist. The guy thinks he's won, but after a flash, he finds our protagonist holding his arm close to his neck. If he moved wrong, it would be over for him. But he doesn't want to talk. He simply kicks the extra's foot. The guy rolls on the ground. Our prota is surprised by his strength. Even though our protagonist is mentally strong, he's physically weak. He's surprised by these abilities he barely knew he had. Also surprised by our protagonist's abilities is the vice captain, who was watching from a distance. Both start to stare at each other. The vice captain wonders about this guy's abilities and movements. They were completely different from before. Now his power is at the level of a master. He wonders if our protagonist is something dangerous to deal with. He doesn't say this out loud, though. Then, an extra appears with a machete in hand. He runs towards our prota. Getting close, he tries several strikes with the machete, but everything he tries misses. This attracts a crowd. People are amazed to see our protagonist dodging the moves of a guy who was extremely skilled. One asks his friend if our prota had some kind of secret training. The other says he doesn't know. This only fuels more curiosity among the extras about what happened there. However, their chatter is interrupted when our protagonist thrusts his hand into his stomach. Holding his sword, he drops it. The guy throws up some blood. He never gave up, so he ended up taking our protagonist's hand. He had nowhere else to run, with no one behind him. The one with the sunken face appeared, using a combat skill called Starshine. It seemed like it would be enough to completely destroy our protagonist. However, our protagonist was just watching, observing his next move. People couldn't believe he would use that skill on someone as weak as our protagonist. But it didn't matter. He ended up using a flash of explosion headed towards him, hitting him directly, and the extra standing beside him smiled, thinking it worked. Our elf looked sad, calling out to our prota. However, after the explosion stopped, he still felt happy, thinking it had worked. But it hadn't. Our protagonist had used his ability to absorb the extra's skill. Since it was a low-level skill, he had no trouble dealing with it. This left everyone even more shocked than before. They didn't understand it. Our protagonist thought of replicating the same skill. Since they didn't know how to use a skill, he saw no reason not to use it against them. So he did, but this time he released a massive beam of light towards the extra. The guy was thrown back, falling flat on his face. The others commented that it wasn't possible for someone as experienced as him to be easily defeated by our prota. But now, the next one to attack was the one who had used the main skill against our protagonist. He turned to him, claiming to be much more superior. But that didn't matter. Our protagonist now had the power to show his strength. He explained to the extra that he now possessed the power of a great master, a powerful one at that. People who had already been skeptical were now just gaping at him in disbelief, especially after seeing his ability. Our elf had known our protagonist's potential, but the extra thought it was still impossible. So, our protagonist wanted to prove he was the strongest. He conjured some fireballs and tried to attack our protagonist with them. Our protagonist asked him to stop using such low-level skills. However, upon reflection, he asked him to use both skills. They would replicate the same skill, but one would have a difference from the other. So they did, and he replicated the same move as the other extra had done before. He wondered what this was, and our vice captain, astonished, asked someone next to him how he could use such powerful breathing. In their view, our protagonist was now compared to a monster. But this caught his attention. He didn't want to be called a monster. The seal in his hand didn't even allow our prota to use that power. Now, he would have to train to get stronger in that aspect. So he stopped. The people who were hoping to see our protagonist's power again were left in shock, trying to understand what was wrong. The final move was supposed to look like that, but nothing happened. Instead, our prota started running towards him. Frozen in fear, he simply saw our prota approaching. He was afraid of our protagonist's strength. However, our protagonist landed a kick in his private parts. Ouch! He felt the pain, falling to his knees. He got back at him for what he did to our elf. Now, our vice captain was quite upset with our protagonist, but he couldn't do anything. He wanted to try, but then a messenger appeared asking him to go to the city because someone important was calling for him. He wondered who this person was. So he explained and understood, so he needed to leave. He wanted to deal with our prota, but as our lucky guy would spare our protagonist for now while he dealt with that main issue of his. He asked for help from those two who were good support for our protagonist. As soon as those two were dragged to a safe place, our protagonist started running towards XOM with our elf there. He ended up asking for help, asking them to call a doctor. But the extras behind didn't care about that. Now they cared about our protagonist, that he was now a stronger guy from this place. They didn't care if she would get to know, well, another world. But here, seeing that these three were useless, he just took her in his arms and started running to a safe place. Now he understands that people by your side only want to be with you when you're strong. When you're weak, you'll suffer. But now our protagonist got the sacred seal. These are his family's abilities, and now there was a right moment for him to act. And now was the perfect time for our protagonist to act for his good revenge against those who humiliated the kid a bit. Well, our protagonist's goal is to get revenge, but he'll have to leave that for later. Here, at the entrance of a house, our protagonist runs with our elf in his arms. However, beside him, several extras also run. They call for our maid, who is startled by the presence of several people here. But this colleague of our protagonist tells her to call a doctor as soon as possible, as she might be kicking the bucket. But our protagonist assures her she won't die that easily. However, to get that quicker and basic care, they keep saying she's dying, so it would be good to call help soon, and this worries our protagonist because he keeps saying she won't die like that. So, she's about to go inside to call a doctor, and our prota keeps following. So, following them, they end up in a room where a guy was kind of doing some weird stuff there, but he gets interrupted by our maid saying a patient arrived. But he turns and says he's not in the mood to heal anyone. At this moment, a person appears and asks him to leave, but he asks him to help our elf recover as soon as possible. But as soon as he says this, he mentions his goal isn't to heal slaves, his goal is to serve only the Lord of the city. Even if they are servants of the Lord of the city, he has no goal to heal them. But our maid says an elf is almost dying. Our protagonist then understands that he won't help her. He asks him to at least hand over some medicines because he could help her recover, but this was also ignored, leaving him hanging. Our protagonist starts to notice something strange. That guy was a bit agitated. Then he turns to that portion of stuff being done there. That guy tries to concentrate, but for some reason, he can't. That thing might basically fail there. So, observing all this, our protagonist realizes the mistake of this guy. He starts saying he added some extra things there, and this won't work. Even if he can hold this for a long time, it will only worsen the situation, and that thing will explode. And sure enough, it explodes. They end up running away. Some didn't want to be caught there by the fire of that explosion, so they ran too. But minutes later, a little while later, they end up coming back. This guy becomes sad because he saw that he threw away materials. So, our maid even told him not to waste the materials they had there from his pharmacy. But he, who here saw that his plan failed, ends up blaming all of this on our blue girl who doesn't understand what happened. Our protagonist, who saw everything that happened, simply stands up and puts her in a safe place, and here he explains that all of this was basically that guy's mistake. Furthermore, he wasted several resources, and this didn't make any sense. He then picks up a paper from the ground and shows it. It was a kind of taboo that shouldn't be done and was only taken by the guilds. Our blue girl, relieved, is a bit shocked. The guy is more shocked. Then she turns to him. Turning around, she kind of says that what he just did there was wrong, and he knew what he did. So, he ends up admitting the fault, saying he did this because he wanted to conduct some academic tests, and this was nothing too much. Then our protagonist steps in front of him and begins to say that what he tried to do was quite useful for improving the talents of a sacred seal. It would allow people to become stronger, but it had quite potent side effects. But soon after saying this guy wonders how he knew what he was doing. But he said he didn't care because he was just a mere slave and his question and his answer here didn't count for anything. But our protagonist says he was willing to help him solve this taboo. Our blue girl pops up next to our protagonist and says that maybe this isn't a joke, and if it was a joke, don't take it seriously. The guy then looks at our protagonist, but looking a little more, he ends up remembering a wanted poster, and this wanted poster was literally our protagonist's face. Both of them then realize that our protagonist was part of the same family that founded that guild they are in. Soon after, our protagonist starts digging through things there. The guy who saw this asks him to take his hands off of it, but our hero really wanted to help them achieve this taboo. So, as soon as he realized this, he ends up thinking that he should accept our hero's proposal. But then he ends up saying that he would accept our hero's proposal, and he wonders if he would really be able to do this. But our little guy says he would. though he wonders why these academic researches. Soon after he says this, he freezes to avoid being caught. He turns to our Bluetail explains that all this was just some basic research for his academy. Then he turns to our PR and says it was a good time to start. But our big girl gives him an annoyed look. He doesn't understand, but then, out of nowhere, one of his subordinates yells that she's already dead. But that wasn't possible. She was awake right there, and she even asks the guy to shut up. Seeing all this, he turns to her, and as he approaches her, he says he'll attend to her first. While he starts treating our elf, he turns to our PR wondering how our protagonist could be doing that, and if he's lying to him, he'd be getting his revenge. After finishing his work, he cures our elf and hands over a potion to him. The potion would help her recover a bit faster. Currently, she's quite weak and wouldn't be able to do anything. While he thanks him for helping the elf, we see our protagonist appearing in the background. He did his best to help the elf recover and thought our PR would thank him, but instead, he just receives a sideways glance. Now our PR appears in front of our elf and starts asking if our elf was alright. However, the other guy is surprised. In his hand, he had what he had spent a week or months creating. He even says he spent years and sort of years researching this thing and only managed to do it in an hour. While he's thinking about it, our elf asks for something to eat. She's weak. He starts looking at that taboo over there. Maybe he would understand how to replicate that thing. But our protagonist appears. Possibly his research is done. He grabs that flask from his hand, saying it smells like fish, but fish has a stronger smell. He understands the scent is good, but he needs the flask. He asks our protagonist to give it back, but he's slow, and it falls to the ground. Seeing this, the guy freezes and doesn't understand why our protagonist did that. Then he explains that his academic task and research were almost done. But now that it's fallen, he laments everything he's lost. He's quite upset now. He grabs our protagonist's collar, wondering how this boy had the audacity to do this to him. He then recites everything he needs to recreate it, but the recipe he recites to him is useless. He then says that what he wanted wasn't really to do research, he just wanted to use it for himself. Upon hearing this, Bluetail says that if he ever uses it, she'll report him to GU, and if that happens, he'll lose everything. But he says he doesn't care because he doesn't belong where he is, he just wants to return to the capital. At this point, everyone is surprised, and our protagonist understands a bit of what happened. But he explains that in the past, he was basically a member of a strong guild in the kingdom that everyone respected. However, this little thing here put some experiments into practice, but he accidentally set everything on fire, and everything important was burned. This caused Alan to be demoted to something almost worthless. As soon as he says this, Bluetail starts to recite that Alan should be something important, but Alan tells her to shut up. He only has the goal of becoming intelligent again to make his research work. If he succeeds, he can return to the kingdom. But now that our protagonist destroyed everything he wanted, he asks our protagonist to recreate it, and if he doesn't, our protagonist says he wouldn't be breaking anything since he was part of a somewhat annoying family, and people recognizing him wouldn't matter much. Moreover, if someone found out he was assisting a pharmacist like him, his reputation would plummet, but he didn't care about that. He just wanted to know the taboos of our protagonist. With that information in hand, he could get everything he wanted. At this moment, he would forcibly take our protagonist's power. However, when he was about to do so, our protagonist realized that not only did he lack a taboo, but he was also increasing his opponent's strength. He had several taboos himself. One of these taboos made his opponent increase their talent level. Upon hearing this, he hesitated. He didn't believe in our protagonist's potential and began explaining that many people in the world exploit these things, aiming to enhance their talent levels. If someone discovered this, they would chase that person, but discovering it was challenging. No one had found out so far. However, our antagonist knew about a new taboo, one that allowed a person's martial art to become much stronger. Even though our protagonist was mocking him, he was the grandfather of one of the world's most powerful men, so he should believe him a bit. While pondering this, a figure carrying an elf appeared, saying they needed to return to base. If they didn't, they'd be in trouble. So, they started heading back. Before leaving, our protagonist turned to the pharmacist, telling him not to say anything. If he happened to teach him anything, he could use it for evil, which would be bad. Still, he didn't care and wanted our protagonist to reveal a taboo to him. However, our protagonist refused. Suddenly, Bloops appeared behind him, telling him to stop as he was ruining the reputation of their guild. Ignoring this, he grabbed our protagonist's leg, hoping to force him to reveal his secret. However, our protagonist laughed at his attempts, realizing how easy it was to deceive him. He promised to tell him another time and returned home. That night, a light could be seen from the window of our protagonist's house. Upon closer inspection, the light was coming from the dish he prepared. He had used some of his powers to add extra protein to the food, making it tastier and softer. Bloops needed to eat nutritious food, which was excellent for her. After eating, they went to sleep, but our protagonist didn't fully sleep. He continued to cultivate while trying to sleep. He attempted to use a technique from his mother, which would allow him to recover quickly. Despite not receiving sacred power, he realized he was quite frail and needed to get stronger as soon as possible. He thanked his parents for giving him such a great power and now needed to become stronger. By becoming stronger, our protagonist would be able to get his revenge. He's getting up now, heading outside by himself, even though he hated his grandfather a lot. He needed to strengthen himself. Currently, he's training a very strong power right there. Even if this power breaks our protagonist's body, he needs to train in it. He tries to do the same training his grandfather did. Soon, several balls of light appear beside our protagonist. They hit him. These light balls that hit our protagonist allow him to reach the maximum potential of his body, even if it breaks his body. He needs to train in this. Now he understands why his grandfather became so strong. This thing nearly broke all of his bones, but he couldn't stand still. His goal was to become stronger. So, several balls of light hit him, but everything was part of his plans. Soon after training just a little, the day ends. But already in the Guild of the Wise from the Ashen Stones, we can see someone complaining about our protagonist. While complaining, he rummages through various things, looking for something that could convince our protagonist to give him a single taboo. So, he keeps searching through many things to find specific recipes. The reason was that our protagonist, before leaving, gave something to our pharmacist. It was the kind of recipe our protagonist needed to find. However, our pharmacist didn't want to find it at all. But our protagonist asks him to mind his own business. If he wants to become strong, he'll have to look for it, and nothing in the world is free. So, he ends up getting tired of searching for it. The only thing he has in his hand, he ends up throwing away. However, regretting the case, this is how we end this video. But if you liked it, leave your like. If you want the continuation, leave your comment below, and remember, it's very good that the lazy soul wants everything but nothing reaches.